Thank you very much, and I think this introduction was a little bit too long, but I'm very pleased to be able to try to start this discussion. We have here ministers former from Australia, from Cabo Verde, from Romania, Serbia, and Armenia. I just wanted to make sure that I'm quite certain who I'm talking to. Actually, I was in Asia last week, and we have not been talking very much about Asia. It's been very much on Europe, and I was there with some friends, former ministers of foreign affairs. We became friends in the NATO cooperation under the Bosnian crisis and Kosovo crisis, and we were for the first time discussing a little bit about Asia, and I think it's very important to discuss a little bit what is happening, because we Europeans are not very used to discussing what is happening in Asia. I myself think that it was once said to me that diplomacy is like skating on a thin ice without getting into the deep water. And I think we are living now rather difficult times. We are seeing a power shift. China is rising. They are the biggest population in the world. It's a very growing economy. Their GDP is about the half of the GDP of the United States. It was just 1/9 of the GDP of the United States in the year 2000. And we know it's going to be the biggest economy in the world in some time. And but per capita income in China is less than $600. And $6,000, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, but that's very small if we compare to Europe, and maybe therefore their focus is more domestic. Their focus in foreign policy is domestic, and it's a rising military power, and in a way China is a big experience, and it is clear that the West is ahead in technology and in education. But the influence of China is growing, and what is the influence of this? There is a dramatic change on the way in the United States foreign policy. They see Asia as a more important player than Europe and the Middle East. We can say that the United States is in a way dragged with the Middle East, Libya, Syria, Israel, Afghanistan, and to a certain extent South America, and they have not devoted enough time to Asia, and they want to get more into Asia and spending less time in Europe. And what influence is that going to have? China does not see a power shift. They see that the West is disseminating, and they feel that the US want them to follow them. They are not in a way interested in great power relationships, and they feel that the US is supporting everything that is against China. They feel that the US has been absent in important meetings. They are asking, where is the threat? What is the target? They are in a way suspicious of all regional institutions. They are in a way lonely and inexperienced in a jealous neighborhood, in a way a learning power. But it is clear that a new order is needed in Asia. China can do it alone, but they are needed to do that. They maybe will do that with shared power from the US, and And Europe is of course also needed in this situation. Europe has the experience, and I think we have to think in Europe how we can come into this situation. In Europe are more experienced with soft power. I heard in South Korea when I was there that when I was listening to President Park, she was talking about trust politics, which China says is very important to build up this trust politics that President Park has introduced when she became the president of South Korea. And actually, it's not only China, it's also Japan that is needed. The relations between South Korea, Japan and China are not good. They are fighting about these islands in the South China Sea. So there is a difficult situation in that part of the world, but this is the part of the world that will be rising, and there is a need for cultural diplomacy. There is a need for soft power in that part of the world, and I think Europe as well as others are needed, and I think we should intensify our cooperation with Asia. I think we are needed there, and I think we need them as well. Maybe I would like to start because we have here a former minister from Australia to tell us a little bit about this, and also we have former president of Cabo Verde, and Africa is of course coming into this picture. Africa is a rising continent, and China is trying to get more influence in that part of the world. And I think later on we might talk a little bit also about Russia. I noticed that Russia was almost not mentioned in Asia. But now we hear a lot about Russia because of the situation in Kyiv, and we have people here who have experience with Russia. So I think we should turn to that later in the discussion. But I would be interested to hear your views on Asia, especially Northeast Asia, and also the conflicts we have there. We have the conflicts about the past. There is no forgiveness from South Korea to the Japanese, and not from China as well, as I read the picture. They are still talking about the past, the wars, and that is not happening so much here in Europe. We have a better situation when we are talking about the World War II and even the war in the Balkans. But as I feel it, there is a lot of tension because of the past in Northeast Asia, and therefore a lot of need for cultural diplomacy. But former Minister Simon Crean, I maybe would like to hear a little bit from you on I was trying to tell, and maybe I'm wrong in some of it, and you know certainly more about it.
Well, that's a very good introduction. Let me try and respond in part. But Mark and I have talked about ICD making a focus on Asia and the Pacific, and it's the main reason, I guess, why I'm up here at this conference. Just a bit about my background. I've just finished 3 months ago 23 years in politics. I won 8 elections in my constituency, and it was about time to get out. But nevertheless, all of the shaping of me in politics still carries through a lot. I've served a number of portfolios, and I led the Australian Labor Party in opposition, and interestingly in that position opposed our government, the then Conservative government, joining with the Americans in the war in Iraq. A position that was vindicated, a position that should have been left to the United Nations, a position that should have been left to the scientific, if you like, the proving, the evidence-based justification for any multilateral action. The other background I think is important for this audience to reflect upon is that Australia was the only developed country in the world to have avoided the global recession. At no stage did we go into negative growth, and we consistently got employment levels and employment records that were the envy of the rest of the world. We did this, of course, with important social safety nets, the point I think you, former Prime Minister, were making in terms of Iceland. But we have one of the better superannuation retirement income policies in the world, a universal healthcare policy, and very significant high minimum wage rates. But that being said, we were the only country that avoided the only developed country that avoided the global recession. And I think for three reasons. One was the stimulus, but most countries embarked on stimulus, so it couldn't have been stimulus alone. I think there were two other important factors. One was that we embraced the need as an economy for structural change. Every economy has to face up to this, and increasingly it's the creative economy that is going to be the driver of the innovation, of the new industries. And I think the President from Cape Verde was talking about this before, the new opportunities in the jobs, not just the cultural experience itself. So the structural changes were important, and that set the economy up for a more open, outward-looking, innovative adapter of innovation, of research, etc. But the second most important reason, I think, is that Australia, ahead of most countries, understood the significance of Asia early, and it engaged with Asia early. I'm delighted that you've observed for the first time today we are talking about Asia, and we should be talking a lot more about it because it is the fastest growing region in the world. And it isn't just China, it is India. Japan has to undergo its structural change, otherwise it will continue to stagnate, but Abe Economics is yet to approach that important question, but it has looked at other reforms that were hitherto considered not possible in Japan. So there is hope in Japan. South Korea, of course, is a unique country that is still considered agriculturally in need of protection, but is a very developed economy. It is now embracing the need to adapt to the services economy. It knows it has to grow its services base if it is going to engage significantly in the rest of the world. But Australia did see the importance of engaging with Asia, and it's not that we turned away from traditional markets of Europe and the US. We still developed those, but we got out of the blocks early and saw the importance of Asia, and we recognised China. We were one of the first countries to recognise China diplomatically, and I was in Beijing at the end of last year to celebrate the 40th anniversary of that recognition, and they have never forgotten it. And that's been important in terms of our relationships with China. But I also believe that it has been significant in our engagement with Asia that it hasn't just been transaction-based. It has been very much relationship-based. And we've just recently produced, as the former government, a white paper on Australia's engagement with Asia, which places a renewed and important emphasis on cultural diplomacy driving it. But what I think Europe in particular needs to understand about Asia, just as I believe we all need to understand in the case of Africa, there's no sense, and I was the trade minister for 3 years trying to get the Doha round concluded. We almost got there, but the almost was not good enough, and it's still not concluded. And I've often reflected on this, and the more countries that have now joined the WTO are increasingly developing countries. You can't just talk open markets to developing countries unless you're also prepared to talk capacity building with them and to support them in that capacity building. There's no point arguing that free markets are the best vehicle if they haven't got the same capacity to compete in those free markets. Now, this goes to technology, it goes to governance, the issues that we've heard about from Nigeria today. It goes to a whole range of things. And this is where I believe we have an important lesson of engagement. For the money, and you say that Iceland is one of the biggest contributors in terms of aid, I think we've got to increasingly look at aid for trade purposes, because lifting the capacity to develop the economy, move into the services economy and become more resilient, more sustainable, a more value-added set of economies, this is the most effective vehicle to get these countries out of poverty. And so I think it needs a multifaceted approach. I think that cultural diplomacy has a key role to play, and I've heard a lot of talk about what governments can and can't do. My simple observation is that governments don't have all the answers, but they do make a hell of a difference. They do make the important decisions. The role of cultural diplomacy and these other soft diplomacies is to inform and influence and better that decision-making process. That's where the dialogue has to develop, and that's what I hope ICD can play a role going forward, particularly with this focus that you've asked me to talk about in Asia.
Well, thank you very much. And this is very interesting when you mentioned the WTO and increasing bilateral agreements on trade. And so if there is no agreement in the WTO, I think the WTO will die, and we will have more bilateral agreements, and I think that is in a way dangerous. But we can come to that later. But maybe we would hear a little bit from Africa and the former president from Cabo Verde, and how Africa sees this development, especially when looking to the rising of China and the influence of China in Africa.
In fact, the influence China in Africa is growing. But why? For two main reasons. Please?
The microphone a little bit closer.
There is another one.
Oh, this is...
First of all, China entered in competition with other countries to obtain raw materials. And in this aspect, the intervention of China was benefitful for the African countries, because the price became more interesting for African countries. For instance, in Niger, no Nigeria, Niger.
Niger, yes.
Yes, the uranium in Niger was exploited by a French company, Areva, and the price was low. And with the Chinese presence, the price increased substantially. And China adopted towards African countries another politics, the loans. China is giving money to the countries without imposing conditions, like the Bretton Woods institution. In Angola, a few years ago, Angola was negotiating with IMF. And IMF was questioning the utilization of funds from petroleum, gas, and IMF imposed the condition the money from petroleum, gas, no? Gas goes to the Minister of Finance, directly to Finance Ministry. And President Eduardo Santos was not, he didn't agree. And China gave him the amount without conditions, you know. I agree that it's necessary to impose some conditions, but for the African country, it is an advantage, you know. It is a facility. It is a facility in these terms, and I think the China's presence in Africa is not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing because the others didn't do more, you know. And I am not. I don't condemn the China's presence in Africa, you know, because China is in competition, and I think that the China's presence obliged some other countries to give more attention to Africa. For instance, during Bush administration, some programs were created to sustain the presence of China in Africa.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. We shouldn't condemn in any way the presence of China in Africa. I think Africa needs China, and we need also in Europe to cooperate with China, and we have, of course, to find ways to that, and I think that has benefited Africa. But of course, there is a need for more understanding between these different cultures. And that, I think, is more complicated nowadays than it was maybe. We live in a more complicated world than we did see 20 or 30 years ago. But I think it would be good to come a little bit nearer to Europe. And you, Mr. President, you would maybe tell us a little bit how you see the situation, being a little bit between Asia and Europe, anyway, nearer to Asia than we others, and you have experience both with Europe and Asia, and maybe you can connect it more than we others who are living in the far west of Europe and then in Australia, which is also far away.
Yeah, as you know, Armenia is a small country, land-located country, a country with old civilization, and we are very proud that officially we were the first Christian country in the world. First Christian country,
Christian,
officially that 301. Well, for time being, Armenia is trying to get an advantage on its location. On one hand, it's a last station, terminus, but on the other hand, really it could be considered as a crossroad. Have a look. On the north, we have Georgia, Orthodox Georgia. Then we have Russia. On the south, we have Muslim Iran, Shia Iran. On the west, we have Turkey, Sunni Turkey. And on the east, we have Azerbaijan, which half Shia, half Sunni. And we would like to consider ourselves that Armenia is the end of Europe and beginning of Asia. And the task for the country should be, and must be, to build a bridge between different civilizations, to be able to bring them together. Just, I would like to outline a couple of wording, a couple of messages on the growing mining of the culture. Look in the modern world, as IT people like to say, within 3 years, information, new created information, is equal to the information created during the whole life of the humanity. Could you imagine the terms? What is going on in the world? A science is always to create a knowledge. An education is to transfer this knowledge, and the culture is storing this knowledge. You know. That is why, let me say that the role of education and culture is going to be increased dramatically. Secondly, economy everywhere is unique. When you are having look to the cars, to the planes, to the mobile phones, you see the same standard, the same technical solutions, innovations. But within this unity, cultural life is becoming more multicultural. You see. The first message I would like to emphasize that the culture is unique to understand. It's easy to understand. Cultural language, educational language. Well, via culture, you are able to understand the person, the nation, the state very quickly. And the culture always is connected with the positive motions. It's never destructive. It's never destructive. This is a very important lesson for us, for the nation which would like to bring together all civilizations. An area of education and culture, economically not good developed countries, they can very quickly to make a big progress. I was mentioning to you that, well, unfortunately in this world, the economic level between poor and rich countries is growing up. The gap is growing. But the cultural level, educational level is getting smaller, which is very interesting event for the modern world. Hence, the role of multicultural education and culture will increase. And I would like to emphasize one more issue for us. You know, having in mind strategic cooperation with northern countries, located northern Armenia, like Georgia and especially Russia, having a strategic partnership with Russia. And on the same time, Armenia is working in the frame of European Union. And the task for my country will be having in mind also the lessons, historical lessons, what we have had, that to be a bridge between these different cultures. The region where we are living is not a very calm region, and we are worried on it. But but I think that we are going to succeed. We are going to show to our people, to our childhood, to our young generation, to use that the model of the multicultural environment will work and will give us advantage in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and I think this is very interesting. This about building bridges between continents, and you with your very old culture and Christianity, you can play a big role there. We in Iceland became Christian in the year 1000, and we believe actually that some of our heathen gods came from your area. And that was a dispute in the year 1000 if we should leave to be heathen and become Christian, and that was done. We became Christian, but those who wanted to be heathen, they should also be Christian, but they could keep their customs in secrecy, and that was in a way a good solution, and then that was forgotten. And I think that was a very good compromise. But then turning to Europe and Serbia, in a way it's very strange to me that Serbia is now, I hope, coming closer and closer to Europe and closer to the European Union. It is not so long ago that we in NATO, and I was then Minister of Foreign Affairs of Iceland, we decided to bomb Belgrade, and it is in a way strange that we look nowadays on each other as friends, and I think that is in a way remarkable, that we have come to that stage, that we have been able to cast the past behind. It's very important because we can't solve anything with talking about the past. The only thing we can do is talking about the future and try to build on that. That is, for example, the problem in Asia between Japan, China, and South Korea, Japan, that they are using too much time on talking about the past, and they are not coming anywhere because they are so occupied with the past. But I think this is amazing, the direction of Serbia, and I would like you to tell us a little bit about Russia, because I have the feeling that you know the Russians very well, and what is happening in Russia. Are we seeing Russia going into the direction of dictatorship? Or we were hoping that Russia would go in the direction of democratic society. We don't see very much of that. We see what is happening now in Ukraine between the West and are we seeing in a way a new Cold War, or what is happening, and how are the Russians thinking now?
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to start by saying that my position is very uncomfortable, because tomorrow is my formal speech with the same title, and I was afraid that you will exhaust all the topics from my speech. That is why I'm not going to reveal you my opinion on everything that you will discuss, because
we understand.
It would have been premature, and I was thinking what to say, which is not so much and so deep mentioned in my tomorrow's speech, I will come back to this topic, which I think that it is important and not included in my speech. To answer to your question, what is the situation in Russia? First of all, it is, I believe, well known, but nobody is discussing the fact that Russia is creating, all together with some neighboring countries, free custom zone, which is similar to the European Union. They have Belarus, they have Kazakhstan, there are some other interested smaller countries, and the issue of Ukraine is exactly that issue. If you look at the idea of creating this free custom zone, they call it CES, which is short for Common Economic Space. And in fact, as far as I know, there are no borders, there are no formal borders, so if you travel to, for example, Belarus, you can go to Moscow and nobody will ask you for a passport or whatever. So my thinking is that Russia is looking forward and considering that the integration is the only way to be important world player in the world economy, and they would like also to have some other countries being a part of this economic space. The issue with Ukraine is exactly the same, because Ukraine should decide whether to join this common economic space or to decide to go to European Union, and then the issue is what will be the relation between, I'm talking about economic relation between Russia and Ukraine once Ukraine decides to sign the stabilization and association agreement, because as far as I know, they're enjoying now some favorable treatment status for the energy, and this is the discussion. I'm not expecting that, in fact, the Russia will go to the dictatorship. I believe that, and I'm not very much familiar with the internal situation, but I believe that the world, globalized world, will act differently, and then, but that in the future there will be a multipolar world, and something has to be done about that, which you will hear tomorrow from my speech what are my proposals. Coming back to something that I wanted to say, and which is in line with this what we put here as cross-continental cooperation, I would support what His Excellency Foreign Affairs Minister, you said about WTO. I believe that the trade is a key word for the cooperation, because trade is the best connector in the world, and we have the experience that WTO countries are experiencing significant GDP growth. I'm not talking about the crisis, but generally. So I would push the trade. Again, I agree that the capacities need to be sufficient capacities established, especially in some countries which are unable to participate directly, but trade is something that we should all support, decreasing the barriers and restrictions, and this will connect the world.
Thank you so much. Maybe I shouldn't have put this question, is Russia going to dictatorship? I agree with you, I don't think that is the case. But I think we have a reason to be worried about the relations between Russia and Europe. There was an agreement between NATO and Russia and for cooperation, and I think that was very important. But we see that there are tensions, And I also agree with you. I think the WTO is very important because Russia has decided to be a part of the WTO. And if the WTO is not working, then there will be a need of free trade agreements between Russia and other states, especially Europe, because Europe is very important for Russia, and Russia is of course important for Europe. And for example, the Scandinavian countries where I have been working very much, we have good relations with Russia, and that is very important because, for example, Finland has a long border with Russia and actually Norway as well. So this is important for the Scandinavian countries as well as the Central European countries.
If I may add just one sentence, I think there is a need for European Union to cooperate with Russia, so to make a good connection between the technology which is present in the European Union and huge resources present in Russia, and that is why both political and other discussion with Russia, in my opinion, should be enhanced.
Well, turning again maybe to Asia and Europe, you mentioned, President from Armenia, that the cooperation both with Asia and Europe is very important. How do you see the regional cooperation in your part of the world? And then I'm talking about a regional cooperation that could combine better these two parts. Then I'm talking about Asia and Europe. And actually, I would like later to ask the former minister from Australia about the build-up of the regional cooperation in Asia, which I think is very interesting. What is going to happen about Asia and so on, because I think there is a big need for closer regional cooperation in Asia, especially including China and Japan and South Korea. And then we have not mentioned the biggest problem in Asia, and that is North Korea. But maybe we would hear a little bit more from you about the regional cooperation.
You know, we are living in the region, and we have had very heavy history. Historically in the region, one cannot say that everything was excellent. But you mentioned an interesting idea, saying that if you want to build a new life, you should not base your ideas on the past. This is very, very important remark. And I would add another one, the second remark on that. Start with culture, start with economy. Don't push too much on the front, the politics. And I think with these two approaches, strategic approaches, will be easy to find a solution. Anyway, we should remember the lessons of the past, but we are not allowed to forget that our task is to build a new life. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. And maybe you would tell us a little bit more about the regional cooperation in Asia. I know that they started this trilateral cooperation between Japan, South Korea, and China with the Secretariat in Seoul. But I can't see that is functioning very well, because there is not the necessary trust among these nations to increase this very important cooperation. But I can see that the United States, Japan and South Korea have very tight, they are cooperating, anyway, trying to cooperate very closely. But the trilateral cooperation between China, Japan and South Korea is not working very well. But they are also coming into the ASEAN cooperation. The ASEAN countries are 10, and then these 3 are sometimes added to it.
I talked about the collapse of the Doha round in 2008 in July. It's very interesting that within 2 months of that, Australia and New Zealand, and Winston Peters, a colleague of mine from New Zealand, will be here later in the conference, but we negotiated successfully within 2 months of the collapse of the Doha round, the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement with Australia and New Zealand, the most comprehensive free trade agreement that the ASEAN countries had entered into separately or collectively. It included services, it included investment flows, it included the issues of behind the border barriers. I say that because it was significant that at a global level we weren't able to conclude what at a regional level we could. And to put this into some perspective, ASEAN as a group of countries is a bigger trading partner for Australia than either China or the US. So collectively this was a big deal. Now off the back of that, these regional groupings that you've talked about were evolving. And it is interesting that Japan, along with Korea, was on Australia's side in arguing for a bigger representation, a bigger grouping of countries within what was emerging as the East Asia summits. It hasn't really progressed, but there's a lot of dialogue going on around that at the moment. One final point that I would make is that it was an earlier government that I was part of that was instrumental in getting APEC established. And not just a grouping of countries, but a grouping of countries that was represented at the political level, the leadership level. This is a very important structure in the region, and if one looks at the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the United States is pushing, another regional grouping, this, if done properly, has the capacity to be the foundation for a larger APEC-based group. The other significance in the APEC structure is the involvement of and the structural development of ABAC, the ASEAN, the Business Advisory Council. In other words, business involved at the table and engaged with the leaders. Now, if the trade is the important starting point, and I agree it is, it can't be trade alone, and that's why I talk about capacity building. It's why we've got to look at the personal relationships and the people-to-people relationships. And that's not just culture, it's education, it's science, technology, it's all of the things that together we can be much more effective at doing. But I really believe that there is the evolution and a structural progress in important trade terms, political terms, and cross-cultural terms that is well worthwhile Europe getting more connected with. And maybe one of the ways to do it is through the business advisory groups in Europe. I happen to be on the Australia-EU Business Advisory Council, but in many ways Australia could be a gateway into Asia. It's better to develop the gateways yourself, but in terms of the relationships now, I think that we could well look to openings that exist and where credibility has been established, where a trust exists and integrity in the relationship exists, and see whether how we can collectively advance that.
Well, I think this is very interesting, and what is going on now, there is negotiations between the United States and Europe on a free trade agreement. And then there is a negotiation on a free trade agreement between the United States, Canada, and Asia, and some South American countries like Mexico and Chile, and I think it's Peru, and so this is very interesting. But then we have a lot of countries in Asia and in South America who are not on this boat. And then, therefore, I think it's interesting that what you are saying, if this agreement will come to a reality, what will happen with the other countries, and what will happen to what Russia is trying to do, and so I think these are interesting questions and are telling us how important the WTO is, and these negotiations will be concluded. And I think this is giving a push to that, and that may be the reason for that the WTO is now moving a little bit, but hasn't been moving for many years.
Yeah. No, I think that's right, and I think the inevitable consequence of the big growth in membership of the WTO and the principle on which it operates, that nothing's concluded till everything's agreed, gives effective veto to any one country. That's the fact of it. So it would be much better to get a global trade agreement. In the absence of it, if it has to come down to the regional approach, those of us that have the capacity to do it have, I think, got to ensure that the principles on which the regional ones develop are WTO consistent, ideally WTO plus. Well,
I think we have had a very good discussion, and I think it is very clear that if I may conclude in some way, that we are in agreement on that trade is very important, common trade, leading to other things. But I think we can also conclude that there is a big need for cultural diplomacy. There is a big need for soft issues, that we look into what can we agree on, what can we do to get closer to each other, what can we do to not forget the past, but leave the past out of important discussions, like what is happening in Europe, especially in the discussions with Serbia. I think others can learn a lot from that. It is not very easy for Serbia. I am very much aware of that, because this was a very rich region. The Balkans and former Yugoslavia was a very, in a way, a rich European country, in a much better shape than many other countries in Europe. So there is a lot of wounds, and it is not easy to come over these wounds. And I think you have succeeded very well. And I think a country like Armenia can play a very big role in connecting Europe and Asia. And it is very clear that Australia, New Zealand are very important in the future cooperation between Asia and Europe, and Asia and the United States. And it is very clear that the United States is going to be a big player in Asia in the future. And I think it is very important for us Europeans to be aware of that we should also be big players, because this part of the world is very important for us. And we have also to remember that we are Europeans important to Asia. China, South Korea, Japan couldn't do very much without European markets and American markets. These markets are fundamental for the progress that is going on to Asia. And now we are seeing how much we are relying on each other. And that should bring us closer, and that is opening a new opportunity for cultural diplomacy, and I think the ICD can play an important role, not only on its own, but also in cooperation with similar institutions in other parts of the world. These are my concluding remarks, but if you, my good friends, would like to add something of your wisdom, I think the audience is ready to listen to that. But we have had a long day, and it is almost 8 o'clock. So I think it is about time to conclude, and I would like to thank you, all of you, for your participation in this good discussion, and wish you all the best in the future. And also thanking the audience for its patience, because I can hear that you have been listening very well to what we have been trying to say, and there has been some, I hope, some wisdom in it. Anyway, I feel it has been a great wisdom from what you have been saying. Thank you once again.